In the winter of 1984, two young hikers vanished from these ridges. Their tent was found days later, torn open from the inside. Their belongings were still here. Their tracks, leading barefoot into the snow, ended in nothing. No bodies, no explanation. Some said it was panic. Others whispered about something older, something that hunts in these mountains. What we found decades later in a cave changed everything. This is the story of the abandoned tent, and it may haunt you long after the credits roll. The first snowfall of the season had a way of silencing the forest, as if the world itself wanted to keep its secrets hidden a little longer. The trees stood frozen in their skeletal shapes, their branches white with frost, their shadows stretching long and thin under the pale November moon. On a forgotten trail in the Rockies, a lone ranger trudged uphill, his boots sinking deep into fresh powder. His breath plumed before him in the frigid air, and each exhale carried a cloud of unease. He had received a call earlier that day. Two college hikers overdue, their families frantic, their route traced to this narrow pass. The ranger knew the mountains well. He knew their cruelty. But nothing in his years of search and rescue had prepared him for what he found when his flashlight beam swept over a small clearing at the ridge's edge. The tent stood perfectly upright, staked against the frozen ground. Its nylon walls glowed faintly under the light, and the flap rippled in the wind like a beckoning hand. He stopped, heart pounding, his instinct screaming that something was wrong. He approached carefully, crunch of snow the only sound. When he pulled the flap wider, the beam of his flashlight cut across a scene that made no sense. Two sleeping bags laid open, side by side. Inside them, faint impressions as if bodies had just been there. On the ground beside them, neatly folded jackets, wool socks stacked together, a thermos still warm to the touch. The couple's boots were propped against the wall of the tent, laces undone. Dinner, instant noodles, 2 bowls, sat half-eaten, 1 spoon still resting inside. But there were no people. The ranger whispered into his radio, his voice shaking. "Base, I've located the camp." Tent intact. No sign of the hikers. A hiss of static. Then, "Copy that. Can you confirm personal effects?" "Yes," he said, his throat dry. "Everything's here. Clothes, food, gear, but—" He swallowed. "They're gone. It looks like they just walked out mid-meal." Silence on the other end. Then the dispatcher replied, cautious, "Stay put. Backup en route." But he didn't stay put. He couldn't, because the moment he stepped back from the tent, he saw them. Footprints in the snow. 2 sets, barefoot. They trailed out of the tent and down the slope into the black forest. No shoes, no coats, just human prints in the snow, toes splayed, heels pressing deep into the powder, as though the hikers had fled in a hurry, leaving everything behind. The ranger's breath quickened. He followed the trail a few steps, shining his light on the prints. They continued for nearly 30 yards, then stopped. Not faded, not blown over, stopped. As if the couple had simply vanished into the air. His radio crackled again, startling him. He pressed the button, his voice a whisper now. "Base, you need to get here fast." "What's wrong?" the dispatcher asked. The ranger stared at the final prints, the snow undisturbed beyond them. His fingers trembled against the radio. Their tracks, they end. Just end. Like they walked into nothing. The forest pressed in around him, the silence crushing. And though he was a man of training and reason, he could not shake the feeling that something in the trees was watching, something patient, something that had been waiting a very long time. The news reached Margaret Ellison on a quiet Sunday morning. Nearly 20 years after the hikers vanished, she had been pouring her second cup of coffee, the kitchen window letting in weak autumn light, when the phone rang. Her life had long since grown into a routine. Morning coffee, crossword puzzles, a walk with the dog. Yet the sound of the phone that morning carved a hollow in her chest. the way it always did when calls came unexpectedly. Too many calls in her life had carried news she couldn't return from. "Mrs. Ellison?" the voice said. A man's voice. Steady, professional. The kind that spoke of authority. "Yes? This is Detective Samuel Hayes, Cold Case Division, Boulder County. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Margaret's fingers tightened on the receiver. Cold case. That phrase had become a shadow in her life, following her into her sleep. "No," she said cautiously. "You're not disturbing me." There was a pause on the line, as though Hayes were measuring his words. "I'm calling regarding the disappearance of your sister, Caroline, and her fiancé, Daniel Price. October 1985. They were last seen on a weekend trek near Horseshoe Ridge." Margaret pressed her lips together. She knew the details by heart, etched into her bones. Still, hearing them spoken aloud after so many years sent a current through her. "Yes," she said quietly. "We've recovered new evidence," Hayes said. Margaret felt her knees weaken. She lowered herself into the kitchen chair, hand trembling against the table. She thought of Caroline, her smile, her quick laugh, the way she had tugged Margaret into every adventure. Caroline had been 22 when she vanished. Margaret had been 19, too young to understand what it meant to lose someone to the void of an unsolved mystery. "What kind of evidence?" she asked. Hayes cleared his throat. "I'd prefer to explain in person. We've reopened the case as of last month. If you're willing, I'd like you to come to Boulder tomorrow morning. There are things we'd like you to see." Margaret stared at the phone as though it might shift shape in her hand. The world outside her window remained unchanged. Leaves scattered across the lawn, her neighbor's dog barking in the distance. Yet the past had just cracked open, spilling forward. "I'll come," she said. Her voice shook, but her decision was steady. "I'll be there." The next morning was raw with wind. Clouds dragged themselves low across the sky, the kind of weather Caroline had always called storytelling weather. Margaret drove into Boulder with a grip too tight on the wheel, her pulse a drumbeat in her throat. The police station loomed gray and severe at the edge of town. Inside, the hallways smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee. Detective Hayes met her at the entrance, tall, mid-40s, his suit jacket slightly rumpled, his eyes serious but not unkind. "Mrs. Ellison," he greeted her, offering a hand. "Thank you for coming." Margaret shook it, her palm cold against his. "You said there's new evidence." "We'll talk in my office," Hayes said. His office was a cramped space with files stacked against the wall and a map of the Rockies tacked above the desk. Red pins dotted the ridges and valleys. Margaret's gaze went immediately to the one near Horseshoe Ridge. She knew without asking what it marked. Hayes gestured for her to sit. "Before I explain, I need to warn you. What we found is disturbing." Margaret nodded, her throat dry. He slid a manila folder across the desk. Inside, photographs, grainy but clear enough. Margaret's breath caught as she stared. The tent. Caroline and Daniel's tent. She recognized it instantly. The old canvas style. Pale green. The one Caroline had insisted on buying secondhand from a friend. She had teased her about it, saying it smelled like damp wool. In the photo, the tent was standing. Not collapsed by time or weather, but upright, intact. Snow dusted its edges, the flap sagging open. The next photo showed the interior. Sleeping bags laid out, a lantern beside them, a thermos with its cap unscrewed. Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth. It looked lived in. Not abandoned decades ago. "When was this taken?" she whispered. 2 weeks ago, Hayes said. His voice was low, careful. "By a ranger on patrol. The site is isolated, high on the ridge. But the tent is there, as though it's been waiting. Intact. Undisturbed." Margaret shook her head. "That's not possible. Caroline disappeared in 1985. That tent should be rotted, shredded by weather. That's exactly the problem, Hayes said. It isn't. It looks as though it was left there yesterday. He leaned forward. And there's more. Inside the tent we found food containers, instant noodles, still fresh. We sent them to the lab. Manufacturing date, 2021. Margaret's breath hitched. You're saying someone's been in that tent? Recently, Hayes nodded grimly. Or they never left it. A silence stretched between them. Margaret stared at the photographs, her mind clawing for reason. Maybe it was a cruel prank. Maybe someone wanted to stir old wounds. But the images were undeniable. The details, Caroline's jacket folded in the corner, Daniel's worn boots against the wall. No stranger could have recreated them so precisely. What does it mean? She asked finally, her voice breaking. Hayes sighed. That's what we intend to find out. We're organizing a full search of the area, and I'd like you to come with us. Margaret blinked at him. Me? You knew your sister better than anyone. You'll recognize things we might overlook, objects, habits. We believe whatever is happening here, it's connected to them. To Caroline and Daniel, Margaret's chest ached with the weight of it. Part of her wanted to flee, to lock the folders shut, walk out, and bury the past once more. But another part, the stronger part, felt the pull of unfinished truth. All right, she said softly. I'll come. That night, Margaret lay awake in her small house outside Denver. The folder of photographs spread across her kitchen table. The images glowed under the lamplight, fragments of a life frozen in time. She remembered Caroline's last phone call before the trek. We'll only be gone 2 nights, Meg. Don't worry. Dan's got the maps, and I packed enough food for an army. You'll laugh at me when I get back, but she hadn't come back. Neither of them had. Margaret traced a fingertip over the photograph of the boots. Daniel's boots, scuffed leather, laces frayed. She had seen him wear them countless times. They had no business being in a tent that looked untouched by decades. The wind outside rattled the windows. Margaret closed her eyes, hearing Caroline's laughter echo across years, sharp as glass. Tomorrow, she would return to the mountains, to the tent, to the place where the footprints had ended. For the first time in decades, the silence around Caroline's disappearance was beginning to crack, and Margaret wasn't sure she was ready for what would pour through. Morning broke pale and brittle, the kind of mountain dawn that carried a cold bite even in October. Margaret found herself standing in front of Boulder County's operations building, a backpack slung over her shoulder. She hadn't packed like she once would have. No sleeping bag, no tent of her own. Just water, a jacket, and the photographs of Caroline's tent tucked into a side pocket. Detective Hayes waited by a black SUV in the lot, conferring with 2 uniformed officers. When he spotted Margaret, he raised a hand in greeting. "Morning," he said as she approached. His eyes flicked briefly over her face. "Did you sleep?" Margaret shook her head. "Not much." "Fair enough," Hayes said. "Neither did I." The officers loaded gear into the vehicle, ropes, radios, evidence kits. Margaret's chest tightened at the sight of it. She had grown up watching her sister plan treks with the same ritual of preparation. Now the same tools were being assembled not for adventure, but for investigation. They drove in silence for the first half hour, the mountains looming larger as the highway wound upward. Pines lined the road like sentries. Margaret stared out the window, her thoughts circling the same loop. Caroline's laughter, Daniel's steady hands, the way they had looked that final morning. She had seen them off herself, standing in their driveway, waving as they drove toward Horseshoe Ridge. Hayes broke the silence. "I read through the original case file again last night. Search parties scoured that ridge for weeks. Dogs, helicopters, volunteers. Not a single trace. No bodies, no clothing. Nothing." "I know," Margaret said softly. She had lived through the fruitless searches, The long vigils by the phone, the slow thinning of hope as weeks became months, then years. But what bothers me most, Hayes continued, is the tent. According to the file, the tent was never found. And now here it is, standing upright, as though time forgot it. Margaret turned to him. Do you believe it? He kept his eyes on the road. In this job, belief doesn't matter. Evidence does, and the evidence says something doesn't add up. The SUV turned off the main highway and onto a winding dirt road. Gravel crunched beneath the tires. Soon the forest swallowed them, the trees thick and dark. Margaret's pulse quickened. This was the landscape Caroline had loved, wild, vast, unforgiving. At the trailhead, the team gathered their packs. Hayes handed Margaret a radio. Stay close. Don't wander. And if you see or remember anything specific, even small details, tell me. Margaret nodded, though her legs felt unsteady. The trail climbed steeply, switchbacks cutting through dense forest. The officers moved in practiced silence, their boots crunching against frost-hardened earth. Margaret lagged slightly behind, her breath clouding in the cold air. She had walked these mountains countless times in her youth, but never with the weight of a sister's ghost pressing against her ribs. After an hour, the trees thinned, opening to a ridge where the wind cut sharp and merciless. And there, tucked against a cluster of boulders, it stood, the tent. Margaret froze, her throat constricted as if invisible fingers pressed against it. It was exactly as in the photographs. Upright, stable. The green canvas taut, the guy lines anchored cleanly into the ground. A dusting of snow clung to the edges, but the fabric itself looked unnaturally preserved. No mildew, no fading. Her breath hitched. For a moment, she could almost believe Caroline and Daniel would step out, laughing, cheeks flushed from the cold. But the tent was silent. Hayes crouched by the entrance, gloved hand resting on the flap. We've secured the site since the discovery. No one's been inside since the ranger. We'll go in together. He looked at Margaret. Are you ready? No, she thought. She would never be ready. But she nodded anyway. Hayes lifted the flap. The air inside was still, faintly musty but not unpleasant. Margaret's eyes fell instantly on the sleeping bags. Caroline's plaid-patterned one and Daniel's navy blue. They were unzipped, opened as if the couple had just risen. On the floor lay Caroline's red windbreaker, neatly folded. A paperback novel rested beside it, the spine cracked at the middle. Margaret's knees nearly gave way. She remembered that book, Wuthering Heights. Caroline had been reading it that very week. The thermos sat between the sleeping bags, lid off. Hayes picked it up carefully. Liquid sloshed inside. He unscrewed the cap, sniffed, and frowned. Still coffee? Fresh Margaret stared at him. That's impossible. He set it down. It shouldn't be here. And yet it is. An officer photographed every angle while another dusted for prints. Margaret moved slowly around the interior, her hand trembling as she reached for the novel. Her fingers brushed the pages. Warm, as though recently held. Her breath stuttered. She whispered, Caroline. Hayes's voice was gentle. Mrs. Ellison. Look here. He pointed to the ground outside the tent. Margaret stepped closer, heart hammering. Footprints, bare, human. 2 sets, pressed deep into the snow. They trailed downhill into the forest, the same way the ranger had described. Margaret's head swam. She crouched beside them, staring. The toes were splayed, the impressions sharp. The prints looked recent, not eroded by wind or time. Her vision blurred. It was as if the decades between 1985 and now had collapsed. She saw her sister and Daniel fleeing barefoot into the trees. Their laughter turned to screams. Hayes touched her shoulder lightly. The prints end about 30 yards down. Same as the ranger reported. Margaret forced herself to stand, her legs shaking. What could make them leave like that? Without boots, without coats? They would have frozen within minutes. That's the question, Hayes said. His jaw was tight. We don't have answers. Only evidence that doesn't make sense. They followed the prints until, just as Hayes said, they ended. Not faded, ended cleanly, in the middle of the snowfield. Beyond them, the ground was untouched. Margaret stared into the forest, the trees looming like watchful figures. A shiver threaded her spine. It's like they walked into nothing, she whispered. Hayes didn't reply. The team worked until late afternoon, cataloging every item, photographing every angle. Margaret moved mechanically, answering questions, identifying objects. But her mind was far away, trapped in a loop of memories. Caroline braiding her hair, Caroline teaching her to skip stones, Caroline waving goodbye that last morning. As the sun dipped, the forest turned blue and shadowed. The officers packed their gear. Hayes lingered by the tent, his gaze sharp and troubled. Margaret approached him. Do you think they're alive? He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw uncertainty in his eyes. I think, he said slowly, that this case is unlike anything I've worked before, and that we're only at the beginning. They hiked back in near darkness, flashlights cutting narrow beams through the trees. Margaret's body ached, but her mind refused to rest. Behind them, the abandoned tent remained on the ridge, standing against the cold, a silent witness to a mystery that had refused to die. That night in her motel room, Margaret sat by the window, staring at the mountains silhouetted against the moon. She couldn't shake the feeling that Caroline was out there still, calling, waiting. But waiting for what? The wind rattled the glass. Margaret whispered into the silence, Where did you go, Caro? The mountains gave no answer. Only the dark and the endless weight of time. The motel's walls were thin. Margaret could hear the cough of a television through the plaster, muffled laughter from the parking lot below, the hum of a vending machine outside her door. But none of it grounded her. Her thoughts stayed on the tent, on the footprints, on the impossible sense that the past had not stayed buried. Sleep came in fitful fragments. When the alarm dragged her up at 6, she felt like she hadn't closed her eyes at all. Detective Hayes met her in the lobby, a styrofoam cup of coffee in hand. He looked only marginally better rested. Morning, he said. We've got something. Margaret's heart jolted. What? He handed her a folder. Inside, photographs. This time, not of the tent, but of items bagged and tagged by the evidence team. A knife with a wooden handle, a matchbook from a diner in Lyons, a page torn from a spiral notebook, words scrawled in faded blue ink. Margaret's hands trembled as she lifted the photo of the note. She read it aloud, voice barely a whisper. It's inside the tent. Her breath caught. The words were ragged, uneven, written in haste. Where was this found? She asked. Hayes rubbed his jaw. Beneath one of the sleeping bags, tucked between the layers. It didn't show in the ranger's initial sweep. We only uncovered it yesterday. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth. That's Caroline's handwriting. You're certain? She nodded, her throat tight. I'd know it anywhere. She always made her tease like that. With the cross too long, Hayes studied her face. Then the question becomes, what was inside the tent? Margaret's skin prickled. Do you think she meant literally? Something, or someone, in there with them. Hayes didn't answer immediately. He flipped the folder shut. We'll run the ink for dating. If it's authentic, we'll know when it was written. Margaret clutched the folder to her chest. It's inside the tent. The words echoed in her skull, louder than the motel TV, louder than the cars on the highway. By noon, the team reconvened at the station. A forensic analyst, pale and precise, laid out the preliminary findings. The thermos contained coffee residue, brewed within the last month. The noodles were commercially manufactured in 2021, as Detective Hayes mentioned, but the packaging showed trace soil consistent with the ridge, meaning they've been up there for some time. How much time? Hayes asked. The analyst hesitated. Weeks, months, perhaps. Not decades, Margaret's pulse stuttered. Then someone's been maintaining the tent. The analyst nodded. Yes, or someone's been living in it. The room fell silent. Hayes tapped a pencil against the table, his expression grim. We need to consider the possibility that Caroline and Daniel didn't simply vanish, that they've been out there, in some capacity, all along. Margaret's stomach turned. That's not possible. They'd be in their late 50s now. Someone would have seen them, not if they didn't want to be seen, Hayes said. Margaret felt dizzy. She tried to imagine Caroline hiding for decades, her vibrant sister reduced to a shadow in the trees. It didn't fit. Caroline had been too alive, too reckless, too full of laughter to vanish willingly. Hayes's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his eyes narrowing. Excuse me. He stepped into the hall. Margaret sat alone at the table, the photographs spread before her. She stared at the knife. Its wooden handle was cracked, the blade dulled. But on the hilt, faint scratches formed initials. C.E. Her breath caught. Caroline Ellison. She reached for the photo, her fingers brushing the glossy paper. That evening, Margaret returned to her motel room, her mind a whirl of images. Caroline's handwriting, Caroline's initials. The tent preserved like an artifact outside of time. The room was dim, the single lamp casting shadows across the bedspread. Margaret sat at the desk, pulling the photographs toward her. She forced herself to look at the note again. It's inside the tent. What had Caroline meant? A literal intruder? Some unseen presence? Or something more abstract? A secret? A terror lodged in their minds? The wind rattled the motel window. Margaret's breath quickened. She imagined Caroline writing the words in a rush, hands shaking, Daniel urging her to hurry. Then folding the scrap of paper, slipping it beneath the sleeping bag as though hiding it for someone to find. But who had she expected to find it? Margaret pressed her palms to her eyes. Her temples throbbed. She wanted to scream at the silence. Tell me what happened. Her phone buzzed, startling her. A text from an unknown number. You shouldn't have gone back to the tent. Margaret's heart lurched. Her fingers hovered above the screen. She typed, Who is this? No reply. She stared at the message until the screen dimmed. The shadows in the room seemed to thicken. The next morning, Margaret showed the text to Hayes. He frowned. Blocked number. Could be a crank. Or it could mean someone's watching the investigation closely. Margaret felt cold. Do you think it's connected? I think we should treat it as if it is, Hayes said. He slipped the phone into an evidence bag. Did your sister or Daniel have enemies? People who might have wanted them gone? Margaret shook her head. No, they were just kids. They were in love. They wanted adventure. That's all Hayes studied her. Sometimes that's enough to put someone in the wrong place at the wrong time. He handed her back the phone. Stay alert. Don't go anywhere alone if you can help it. Margaret nodded, though unease gnawed at her. She thought again of the footprints in the snow, the way they ended mid-field. Not faded. Ended. As though Caroline and Daniel had stepped out of the world itself. And now someone wanted Margaret to stop looking. That night, sleep eluded her once more. Every sound outside, a car engine, footsteps in the lot, a door closing, made her sit up, heart racing. At midnight, unable to bear the confinement of the room, she wrapped herself in a coat and stepped outside. The air was sharp, the stars brittle in the sky. She walked the length of the parking lot, her breath fogging in front of her. The shadows between the cars seemed deeper than they should have been. And then she saw it. On the windshield of her SUV, tucked beneath the wiper blade, was a folded scrap of paper. Her hands shook as she pulled it free. 3 words scrawled in hurried ink. "It's still inside." Margaret stared at the scrap of paper in her trembling hands. The ink looked fresh, the strokes dark and sharp. "It's still inside." The words bled into her mind like poison. She glanced around the parking lot. The night was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of highway traffic. A lone streetlight flickered above, casting weak light across the row of cars. Shadows stretched long and deep between them. "Hello?" she called softly, her voice catching in the cold air. "Is someone there?" Silence. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She shoved the paper into her pocket, hurried back into the motel, and locked the door behind her. Sleep was impossible. She sat on the bed fully dressed, staring at the note over and over. The first scrap had been Caroline's handwriting. This one was different, harsher, unfamiliar, but the message was unmistakably linked. By dawn, she had made her decision. She would show Hayes immediately. Detective Hayes's jaw tightened as he studied the note, now sealed in an evidence bag. "Someone's watching us," he said flatly. "Watching you." Margaret's throat was dry. "Do you think it's the same person who sent the text?" "Could be," Hayes said. He rubbed his temple. "Could also be someone who's been keeping that tent intact. Whoever it is, they're trying to warn you off. Or lure you back." Margaret's stomach churned. "Then we need to go back." Hayes looked up sharply. "Absolutely not. It's dangerous." She leaned forward. "Detective, you don't understand. That note isn't random. Caroline left the first one. It's inside the tent, and now someone's saying it's still inside. If she was trying to tell me something, I can't ignore it." Hayes studied her for a long moment, his eyes weary but intent. Finally, he sighed. "If we go back, we do it properly. Full team, broad daylight. Agreed?" Margaret nodded, relief flooding through her. By late morning, they were on the trail again, this time with a larger search group, 6 officers, all armed. Hayes walked at the front beside Margaret. The forest was hushed beneath a sky of shifting clouds. Their boots crunched through frost and old leaves. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. When they reached the ridge, the tent awaited them. Margaret's chest tightened. It looked exactly as before, its canvas unstained, its lines perfect against the snow. Time seemed to bend around it. Hayes gave the signal. The officers spread out, securing the perimeter. 2 moved inside the tent with cameras and gloves. Margaret stayed just outside, her arms folded tight against her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to go in, to look herself. Hayes must have sensed her tension. "You'll see what we find," he promised. Minutes passed. Then one of the officers called out, "Detective!" "Over here!" Hayes ducked inside. Margaret followed despite herself. The officer was crouched near the far corner of the tent. He held up a small cloth pouch, weathered but intact. Hayes took it carefully, opening the drawstring. Inside were teeth. Human teeth. Margaret's breath broke into a sob. She staggered back, her hand covering her mouth. "Easy," Hayes said quickly, steadying her. He turned to the officer. "Bag it. Get it to the lab immediately." Margaret shook her head violently. No, that's not Caroline's. It can't be. We don't know yet," Hayes said gently. "But this could be what she meant by inside the tent." Margaret's vision blurred with tears. Caroline, Daniel. One of them had been here, had tried to leave a message. And now there were teeth in a pouch, hidden like a grim secret. Hayes guided her outside for air. The wind cut across the ridge, sharp and merciless. Margaret wrapped her arms tighter around herself. "What does this mean?" she whispered. Hayes's face was grim. "It means this is no longer just a disappearance. It's a crime scene." They descended the mountain late in the afternoon, the pouch of teeth secured as evidence. Margaret felt hollow, as though the wind had carved her from the inside out. Back at the station, Hayes promised results from the lab within a few days. Dental records will tell us if they're Caroline's or Daniel's, or someone else entirely. Margaret could barely nod. Her mind buzzed with questions, none with answers. In her motel room that night, she sat at the desk, staring at the empty wall. She had thought she wanted answers. But what if the truth was worse than silence? The heater rattled to life. Outside, the parking lot was still. She opened her notebook and forced herself to write, just as she had when Caroline first disappeared all those years ago. If it's still inside, what does that mean? Inside the tent? Inside the mountain? Inside me? Her pen hovered, then pressed down harder. What if Caroline never left at all? The next day dawned gray and cold. Hayes called her into his office mid-morning. He was pale, a file open before him. "The lab rushed the analysis," he said. His voice was steady, but Margaret sensed the weight behind it. She braced herself. "Whose were they?" Hayes exhaled slowly. "The teeth belonged to Daniel Price." Margaret's knees gave out. She collapsed into the chair, her hands gripping the armrests. "No," she whispered. "No, that can't be right. He was supposed to come back with her." They were together. Hayes's gaze softened. "I'm sorry." The dental records are conclusive. Margaret's vision swam. She saw Daniel's face in flashes. His crooked smile, the way he had carried Caroline's pack when the trail grew steep. She remembered him promising her that night before the trek, "I'll keep her safe, Meg. Don't you worry." And now his teeth had surfaced in a tent that should not have existed. "What about Caroline?" she asked hoarsely. Hayes shook his head. "No sign." Not yet. Margaret clutched the arms of the chair until her knuckles whitened. Part of her wanted to crumble, to retreat back into grief's silence. But another part flared with fury. "If Daniel's remains are there," she said through clenched teeth, "then Caroline saw what happened. She tried to warn us, and someone made sure she never came back." Hayes didn't argue. His silence was answer enough. That night, Margaret dreamed of the tent. She saw it glowing faintly on the ridge, its canvas walls pulsing like breath. She stepped closer, her heart hammering, and Caroline's voice whispered from inside, "It's still here, Meg. It never left." She woke gasping, the words clinging to her like frost. And for the first time, she felt certain of one thing. Caroline had never left those mountains. She was still out there, somewhere. Snow fell in light flurries the morning after the lab results. Margaret stood outside the station, watching her breath cloud in the air. Each exhale seemed heavier than the last, as though grief itself had weight. Daniel's teeth. A pouch hidden beneath the sleeping bags. A tent preserved against time. She pressed a hand to her chest. The thought of Caroline alone, perhaps forced to witness what had happened, pressed down on her until she could hardly breathe. Detective Hayes emerged from the station, his coat collar turned up against the cold. He carried a thermos of coffee, offered it wordlessly. Margaret took it, grateful for the heat against her palms. "You should go home," Hayes said gently. "Get some distance." "This case? It's too close." Margaret shook her head. "If it was your sister, would you leave?" His silence was answer enough. Inside, Hayes briefed her on the latest findings. No fingerprints on the pouch. No recent DNA. The matchbook we found from the diner in Lyons dates to a reprint series in 1986. That matches your sister's disappearance. Margaret leaned forward. "So whoever kept that tent alive wanted us to connect it to Caroline. They left breadcrumbs, or," Hayes said grimly, "they were reliving the crime." Rebuilding the scene, Margaret's stomach tightened. "Like a shrine." Hayes nodded slowly. "Or a message." The thought made her shiver. That afternoon, Hayes drove her to Lyons. The town was small, quiet, its main street lined with brick storefronts and faded awnings. The diner still stood at the corner, neon sign flickering. Inside, the booths were cracked vinyl, the air heavy with coffee and fried onions. A waitress in her 60s greeted them with a weary smile. "What'll it be?" she asked, sliding menus across the table. Hayes flashed his badge. "We're with Boulder County. We have a few questions about your place here." The waitress raised her brows but nodded. "Go ahead." He produced the photo of the matchbook. "Do you recognize this?" Her expression softened. "Lord, that's an old one. We handed those out back in the 80s. Haven't seen one in years." Margaret leaned in. "Do you remember a young couple? My sister, Caroline, and her boyfriend, Daniel. They would have come through here in October of 1985. The waitress frowned, thinking, "Honey, I've seen thousands of couples in that booth alone." But she hesitated. "There was a pair I remember. They looked young, happy. The girl had this loud laugh, filled the whole diner. I liked her, but—" Her voice trailed off. "But what?" Margaret pressed. The waitress's eyes darkened. They weren't alone. They were talking with a man, older, gray hair, mustache. Something about him put me off. Too quiet, if you know what I mean. Sat there drinking coffee while the kids ate. Didn't smile once Margaret's blood ran cold. "Do you remember his name?" The waitress shook her head. "Never gave it, but I remember his eyes, flat, like he wasn't really there." Hayes exchanged a look with Margaret. It matched nothing in the file. The original investigation had no mention of a third person. As they left the diner, Margaret whispered, "That's who was inside the tent." They drove back in silence. Margaret stared out at the passing landscape, fields brittle with frost, barns sagging under years of neglect. Her mind spun. Caroline's laughter in the diner, an older man watching, silent, eyes flat. Daniel's teeth hidden decades later. The pattern was forming, jagged and terrifying. That night, Margaret sat at the motel desk, spreading photographs across the surface. The tent, the footprints, the notes, the pouch of teeth. She drew lines between them with a pen, trying to map the logic. But every connection led to the same conclusion. Someone had been there, watching. A knock rattled her door. Her heart leapt. She wasn't expecting anyone. She rose cautiously, peering through the peephole. A man stood outside, coat dusted with snow. His hair was gray, his mustache thick, his eyes flat. Margaret's breath seized. She stumbled back from the door. "No," she whispered. "Not possible." The knock came again, louder. "Mrs. Ellison." His voice was low, calm. "I know what happened to your sister." Margaret's hands shook violently. She snatched her phone, dialing Hayes's number. No signal. The knock came a third time, sharp and insistent. "I just want to talk," the man said. Margaret backed further into the room, heart pounding. The motel's walls suddenly felt paper thin, the shadows pressing closer. The doorknob rattled, and then silence. She held her breath, straining to hear. Footsteps retreated down the walkway. When she finally dared to look, the hallway was empty. Only a scrap of paper rested on the floor outside the door. She picked it up with trembling fingers. "You're next." Margaret barely slept. By dawn, she was waiting in Hayes's office, the note clenched in her fist. He listened in silence, his expression grave. "You saw him?" "Face to face." Margaret nodded shakily. "Gray hair. Mustache." He looked exactly as the waitress described. "Detective, he's alive. He's still out there." Hayes leaned back, exhaling slowly. "If he's targeting you, then we're running out of time." Margaret clutched the note tighter. Her voice was hoarse, but resolute. "Then we find him. Before he finishes what he started." The photograph was grainy, black and white, its edges yellowed with age. Hayes slid it across the desk toward Margaret. "This was taken in 1982, he said. 3 years before Caroline vanished." Margaret leaned forward. The photo showed a crime scene. A collapsed tent in Wyoming. The snow around it trampled with boot prints. 2 young hikers had disappeared there. Never found. But her eyes locked on the background. Standing behind the search team was a man. Gray hair, mustache. Her chest constricted. "It's him." Hayes nodded grimly. "Name on file is Charles Lang, but that's not his only name. He's used at least 6 over the years. Charlie Carnes, Charles Latham, Carl Langford. Always some variation." Margaret's throat went dry. "How many disappearances?" Hayes opened another folder. 8 confirmed across 3 states. Always hikers, always young couples, always an abandoned campsite left behind. He's been a ghost in these mountains for decades. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth. "And Caroline, she was one of them." Hayes's eyes softened. "Yes, but she may have been the last who tried to fight back. That note you found, it's the first message we've ever recovered from one of his victims." Margaret's stomach churned. Her sister had left a message in desperation, trying to name the horror stalking them. "It's inside the tent." Now Margaret understood. The man wasn't outside, circling. He was inside their lives, their safety, their laughter. Waiting. Later that afternoon, Hayes drove them to a secure evidence facility on the outskirts of Boulder. Inside, the cold air smelled faintly of dust and old paper. Rows of shelves stretched endlessly, stacked with boxes marked by year and case number. "This is where cold files go to die," Hayes muttered. "But sometimes the past still has teeth." They located the box marked Horseshoe Ridge Disappearance, 1985. Margaret's heart ached as Hayes set it on the table. Inside were photographs she hadn't seen in years. Caroline and Daniel smiling on the trail, Margaret herself in the background waving them off. Police reports filled with clinical phrases. Last known location, presumed deceased. And then, at the bottom, a cassette tape. "What's this?" Margaret asked, frowning. Hayes examined the label. Interview, Ranger Report. October 1985. He slid it into an old player. The tape crackled, then a man's voice filled the room. "This is Ranger Thomas Kearney, reporting on the Horseshoe Ridge case. Day 3 of the search. We found signs of fire near the tree line. Wood stacked neatly, but never lit. And footprints. 3 sets. 2 belong to the missing couple. The third is larger, male. Barefoot." The tape clicked. Silence followed. Margaret felt ice spread through her veins. 3 sets, not 2. Hayes's jaw tightened. The original investigators dismissed it, thought it was contamination from a volunteer searcher, but they were wrong. Margaret clutched the edge of the table, her nails digging into the wood. So he was there. The whole time Hayes looked at her. And now he's back. That evening, Margaret sat in her motel room, the cassette still echoing in her mind. 3 sets of footprints, Caroline's terrified note, Daniel's teeth hidden in a pouch. A knock startled her. She froze. This time, it was Hayes. He stepped inside quickly, shutting the door. His expression was tense. "We've had another report." 2 hikers, college students, never came back from a trek last week. Same ridge. Margaret's stomach lurched. "No. Yes," Hayes said. "We're assembling a search team tomorrow, and if Charles Lang, or whatever he calls himself now, is active again, we may not have much time." Margaret's chest tightened. For decades, she had believed her sister's disappearance was a closed chapter, a wound with no answers. But now the pages were being torn open again, and fresh blood was spilling onto them. She looked Hayes in the eye, her voice steady despite the fear in her veins. "Then we find them. We find him. And this time, we don't let him vanish back into the dark." The following morning, the search team gathered at the base of Horseshoe Ridge. Margaret stood among them, her boots planted firmly in the snow. She was no longer just a grieving sister. She was part of the hunt. As the wind whipped through the pines, she whispered Caroline's name under her breath. For the first time in 16 years, she felt her sister close by, and she swore she would not let her down again. Snow whipped sideways across Horseshoe Ridge, the wind sharp as glass. Margaret trudged behind the line of searchers, her breath ragged. Every step echoed with the past, Caroline's laughter, Daniel's promise, the hollow silence that had followed. The team fanned out across the slope, neon jackets bright against the gray-white storm. Hayes walked point, his hand resting near the radio at his belt. "Stay close," he called over the wind. "Visibility's going to drop fast." Margaret pulled her scarf higher. The air bit her skin, but it was the silence between gusts that unnerved her most. No birds, no rustle of animals, only the sound of their own boots breaking snow. Half an hour into the climb, a shout rang out from the left flank. "Over here!" The team converged. A young officer pointed at the snow. A trail of prints cut across the slope, not boots, not shoes, bare feet. Margaret's pulse spiked. "It's him," she whispered. Hayes crouched, studying the prints. Large, male, no tread. The same as the old ranger report. Margaret hugged herself against the cold. She could almost see him, the gray-haired man moving silently through the trees, skin to snow, leaving no other trace. The team followed the trail upward. After 20 minutes, the prints ended abruptly near a cluster of boulders. No sign of struggle, no exit trail, just an end. Hayes muttered, "Same as before." Margaret stared at the snow. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. By late afternoon, the storm thickened. The team pressed on, scanning the tree line. Then another shout, "A tent!" Margaret's stomach clenched. She forced her legs to move faster, her boots crunching through drifts. There it was, a dome tent, half collapsed, fabric fluttering in the wind. Hayes approached first, his gun drawn. He pulled the flap open. Inside were 2 sleeping bags, empty. A kettle still sat on a camp stove, its surface coated in frost. Margaret's breath caught. "The missing students." Hayes nodded grimly. They were here. Recently, Margaret stepped closer, her eyes sweeping the interior. On the floor, near the stove, lay a spiral notebook. She knelt, lifting it carefully with gloved hands. The last page was filled with shaky handwriting. "We're not alone. He's watching us from the trees." Margaret's throat tightened. She imagined the students huddled here, writing in panic, glancing at every shadow. Hayes's radio crackled. "Detective, we've got something. North perimeter." They rushed through the trees. 2 officers stood near a hollow trunk. Inside lay a backpack, torn open, contents scattered. Books, a water bottle, a phone smashed into pieces. No bodies, no blood, just absence. Hayes cursed under his breath. "He's playing the same game again." Margaret's voice shook. "Then the students are still alive." Hayes didn't answer. His eyes scanned the forest, sharp and wary. The wind howled through the branches like distant laughter. Night fell quickly. The search team set up camp at the base of the ridge, too dangerous to descend in the dark. Tents rose in neat rows, lanterns casting pale light. Margaret sat near the fire, staring into the flames. Her hands shook despite the heat. Hayes sat beside her. "You shouldn't be here." Margaret didn't look at him. "I need to be. If this is the same man who took Caroline, then finding him is the only way I'll ever breathe again." Hayes studied her profile, his expression unreadable. "You know, obsession can kill as surely as any predator." Margaret finally turned to him, her eyes fierce, and silence kills slower. 16 years of silence has been its own death. Hayes nodded once, accepting her resolve. The fire cracked. Beyond the glow, the forest pressed close, dark and unknowable. Margaret thought of Caroline. She imagined her sister's voice carried on the wind, whispering from the trees. "Don't stop, Meg. Don't stop now." In the middle of the night, Margaret woke to the sound of footsteps outside her tent. Slow, deliberate. Her breath caught. She listened, heart pounding. The steps moved past her tent, crunching softly in the snow. She reached for the zipper, hesitated. Then, summoning courage, she eased it open an inch. Moonlight spilled across the camp. Lanterns flickered in the cold wind. And there, just beyond the fire's dying glow, stood a figure. Tall, gray hair, mustache, barefoot. He was watching her. Their eyes met across the darkness. His expression was unreadable, calm. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he turned and melted back into the trees. Margaret gasped, stumbling out of the tent. "Hayes!" she cried. "He was here!" The camp erupted. Officers grabbed flashlights, weapons. Beams of light cut through the trees, sweeping desperately. But the man was gone. Only the snow bore witness. And even there, his footprints ended after 10 paces. At dawn, Margaret sat by the fire, exhaustion etched into her face. Hayes approached, his jaw tight. "We'll keep searching. But he's toying with us. He wants you to see him." Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. "Then he knows who I am." Hayes's silence was answer enough. The fire hissed. The forest loomed. Margaret lifted her gaze to the ridge, determination burning through her fear. If he wanted her to see him, then she would, and she would not look away. The ridge was silent that morning, the storm blown off into a pale blue sky. Frost clung to the trees like brittle lace. Margaret walked with the search team, every nerve raw from the night before. She had seen him, not a shadow, not a dream. The gray-haired man, watching her across the firelight. His eyes flat, almost curious. Hayes had doubled the perimeter, posted officers at every path. But Margaret knew it wouldn't matter. The man had lived in these mountains for decades. The forest was his house. The rest of them were guests. An unwelcome thought chilled her. What if Caroline had been a guest all along? By midday, the team reached a clearing where the snow thinned and the ground broke into frost-bitten grass. An officer raised a hand. "Something here." They gathered around. A tree trunk loomed at the edge of the clearing, its bark scarred with shallow carvings. Hayes brushed the surface with gloved fingers. Letters, dozens of them. Initials carved into the wood at varying heights. Margaret leaned in, her heart stuttered. There it was. C+D.P. Caroline Ellison. Daniel Price. Her throat tightened. She was here. Hayes's gaze followed hers. Could have been before they disappeared. Margaret shook her head. No, she hated carving into trees. Said it was like hurting the forest. If she did this, she was desperate. Hayes frowned, studying the other initials. Some were faded, nearly erased by time. Others fresh. Too fresh. "Who else?" Margaret whispered. Hayes didn't answer. He stepped back, eyes sweeping the clearing. In the grass lay a bone, small, pale, gnawed at one end. Margaret recoiled. "Oh, God! Animal remains!" Hayes said quickly, crouching. But his tone lacked conviction. Margaret hugged herself. The forest suddenly felt alive with eyes, watching from every shadow. They pressed on, moving deeper into the ridge. Margaret trailed close to Hayes, clutching the notebook they'd found in the student's tent. The last words haunted her. "He's watching us from the trees." By late afternoon, they came upon a narrow ravine. Snow clung to its edges, the drop steep. At the bottom lay what looked like an old lean-to, half-collapsed. Hayes signaled. 2 officers descended carefully, ropes securing them. Minutes later, their voices echoed up. "Detective!" "You need to see this." Hayes and Margaret followed, boots slipping on the icy slope. At the bottom, the lean-to revealed its contents. Scraps of fabric, torn sleeping bags, rusted cookware, and beneath a slab of stone, a journal. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened it. The pages were water-stained, the ink blurred, but fragments remained. October 16th, 1985. He won't let us leave. Daniel is sick. I don't know how long we can last. Margaret's eyes blurred. Her sister's handwriting. Caroline's voice reaching across 16 years. Hayes's jaw hardened. This proves she survived longer than anyone thought. Margaret's chest heaved. She was alive. Alive and trapped. She turned another page. He says we're chosen. Says the mountain keeps us. I don't believe him. I have to get a message to Meg. Margaret's heart broke. She whispered, "She tried." She tried to tell me at the bottom of the page, smudged but legible, was a final line. If anyone finds this, don't trust the man with no shoes. Margaret closed the journal with shaking hands. No shoes. Barefoot in the snow. The same prints the ranger had seen, the same prints leading them in circles even now. She looked at Hayes, her voice hoarse. He's not just hiding. He's hunting. Hayes nodded grimly. And he wants us to know it. They hauled the journal back to camp, the weight of it pressing on Margaret's soul. She sat by the fire, tracing the ink with her fingertips. Caroline had been alive, desperate, writing into the void. All those years, while Margaret had searched, cried, prayed. Her sister's words had been buried under stone and snow. Hayes approached, his face drawn. "We'll have the lab examine the journal. See if there are more legible pages." Margaret clutched it to her chest. It's her voice. It's all I have left. Hayes hesitated, then crouched beside her. His voice softened. "We'll get him, Margaret. I promise you that." Margaret stared into the fire. The flames licked higher, devouring the wood. She thought of the lean-to, the carved tree, the warning about the man with no shoes. Her grief was no longer passive. It was sharp, burning. Caroline had left breadcrumbs through the dark, and Margaret would follow them, even if they led into the jaws of hell. That night, she dreamed again of the tent. This time, Caroline was inside, sitting cross-legged, her hair matted, her eyes hollow. She held out the journal, her voice a whisper. "It's still inside, Meg. It's always been inside." Margaret woke with a gasp, the words seared into her skull. She realized then what Caroline had meant all along. The danger wasn't just in the tent. It wasn't just in the mountains. It was in the man himself, the one who had lived among them, vanished into the snow, leaving no prints except bare feet. And now he was inside Margaret's life, pulling her into the same labyrinth of terror. She sat upright, clutching the journal in her lap. Whatever it took, she would drag him into the light, even if it cost her everything. The journal stayed close to Margaret, as if it were a living tether to Caroline. She kept it tucked inside her jacket even as the team hiked higher into the ridge. The cold bit deeper here, the trees thinning into skeletal spires, shadows etched sharp across the snow. Hayes moved steadily at the front, but Margaret noticed something shifting in the group. The officers spoke less, their eyes darting into the trees, fingers twitching near their rifles. The man with no shoes was no longer just a legend. He had stepped through their camp, breathed their air, vanished like smoke. And the journal made it clear. Caroline had known him, feared him. By mid-morning, the team found another trace, a scrap of fabric caught on a branch, faded red, torn at the edge. Margaret froze. She knew that pattern. Caroline's jacket. She had given it to her for her 19th birthday. Her throat closed. "It's hers," she whispered. Hayes examined it, his brow furrowed. "It's been out here a long time." Margaret's eyes burned. "Then we're walking through her grave." As they moved on, Margaret felt something shift within her. The journal, the carving, the scrap of fabric, all of it pulled her deeper into Caroline's last days. She began to imagine her sister's footsteps on the trail, the sound of her laugh swallowed by the trees. But there was something else gnawing at her. The footprints. They always ended. The man with no shoes didn't just walk into the woods and disappear. He chose when to vanish, and that meant he knew the land better than anyone. That afternoon, while the team rested, Margaret walked the perimeter. She needed air, space from the close hum of voices and radios. Snow crunched softly beneath her boots. She trailed her gloved fingers along the bark of a tree, staring at the frost glittering in the late sun. A voice behind her made her flinch. "Careful wandering off." She turned. It was one of the younger officers, Sanders. His face was pale, eyes shadowed. He glanced at the journal clutched against her chest. "You carry that everywhere," he said. "Like it's gold." Margaret stiffened. "It's my sister's." "It is gold." Sanders' mouth curved into something not quite a smile. "Or bait. Ever think of that? Maybe he left it so you'd follow." Margaret's stomach dropped. She hadn't considered it. But the thought wormed in quickly. Was Caroline's journal truly a voice from the grave, or a lure? Sanders stepped closer, his breath fogging. "If he knows you're here, maybe you're not a searcher at all. Maybe you're the hunted." Before Margaret could answer, Hayes called her name from camp. She turned toward the sound. When she looked back, Sanders was already walking away, his shoulders hunched, his rifle swinging loose. That night, the team camped near a frozen creek. The moon carved silver across the snow, the air brittle with silence. Margaret sat by the fire, the journal open in her lap. She traced her sister's words again and again. "If anyone finds this, don't trust the man with no shoes." She looked up at the circle of officers. Their faces were gaunt in the firelight, eyes flicking nervously into the darkness. Don't trust. What if the danger wasn't only out there? What if he had found a way in? Hayes settled beside her, pouring coffee into a tin cup. "You're shaking." Margaret closed the journal quickly. "I'm fine." He studied her, his eyes steady. "No one's fine out here." "Not really." Margaret hesitated, then leaned closer. "One of your men, Sanders." He said maybe the journal's bait. Hayes frowned. "Did he now?" She nodded. He looked different. Off, like he wasn't afraid of the man out there, like he already knew him. Hayes's expression hardened. He scanned the camp, his gaze locking briefly on Sanders, who sat cleaning his rifle, head bent low. "We'll keep an eye on him," Hayes murmured. Margaret's hands clenched tighter around the journal. She wanted to believe Hayes, but suspicion crawled through her veins like ice. What if Sanders was right? What if the journal had been planted? What if Caroline's words had been twisted into a trap? The fire cracked loudly, making her flinch. In the flickering light, she could almost see her sister's face beyond the flames, pale, hollow-eyed, whispering the same warning again and again. Don't trust. Sometime after midnight, Margaret woke with a start. The camp was silent except for the whistle of the wind. Then she noticed Sanders' tent was empty. Her heart hammered. She grabbed the journal and crept from her tent. At the edge of the trees, a figure moved. Sanders, his silhouette barely visible in the moonlight, striding away from camp. Margaret's breath caught. She followed, her boots crunching softly. Sanders moved quickly, weaving through the trees as if he knew the path. She trailed him, clutching the journal against her chest. After 10 minutes, he stopped. Ahead, a faint glow flickered. A lantern. Margaret crouched behind a tree, her pulse thundering. Sanders approached the light. Another figure waited there, tall, gray hair, mustache, barefoot. The man with no shoes. Margaret's blood iced over. Sanders spoke in a low voice, too far to hear. The older man nodded slowly, his expression calm. Then, as if sensing her presence, the barefoot man turned his head. Their eyes met across the dark. Margaret gasped and stumbled back. Her boot cracked a branch. Both men snapped their heads toward her. Sanders shouted, "She's here!" Margaret turned and ran, snow spraying around her legs. Her breath tore in her throat. the journal clutched in one hand. Branches clawed at her coat, her lungs burned, but she didn't stop. Behind her, footsteps pounded. She burst into the clearing of the camp, screaming, "Hayes! Hayes!" The search team erupted, lights flashing, rifles raised. Sanders stumbled into the clearing a moment later, his face twisted with rage. "She's lost it!" "She's seeing things." Margaret pointed, trembling. "He was there. With him. The man with no shoes." The team froze. Silence pressed down like snow. Then Hayes stepped forward, his gun drawn, his voice low and dangerous. "Sanders, drop your weapon." Sanders' eyes darted around the circle of rifles. His chest heaved. For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. Then Sanders raised his hand slowly. The rifle dropped into the snow. Margaret clutched the journal to her chest, her whole body trembling. She had been right. The danger wasn't just outside the tent. It was inside their circle all along. Sanders sat bound at the wrists, a lantern throwing stark light across his pale, sweat-slicked face. The rest of the team circled him, their expressions tense, rifles close at hand. The forest pressed in from all sides, silent, as if listening. Hayes crouched in front of him. His voice was low, deliberate. "You're going to tell us everything." Right now, Sanders swallowed hard, his eyes flicking to Margaret. "She doesn't understand. None of you do. He's been here longer than the trees, longer than any of us. You can't fight him." Margaret's fists clenched. "Then why were you with him?" Sanders's gaze met hers. For the first time, she saw not defiance, but a strange reverence. "Because he chose me. The mountain chose me. Same way it chose your sister." Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. "Don't you dare say her name." Hayes's jaw tightened. "What did he promise you?" Sanders laughed bitterly. "Promise? He doesn't need to promise. He shows. He survives when others vanish. He walks barefoot in the snow and doesn't bleed. He doesn't age. You think you're hunting a man. You're hunting a ghost." An uneasy silence rippled through the circle. Hayes leaned closer, his tone sharp. "Ghost or not, he bleeds. And if you don't start giving me something useful, you'll regret it." Sanders's smile was thin. "I already regret everything. But it doesn't matter. He knows where we are. He's probably watching right now." The fire cracked. Margaret's skin prickled. She could feel eyes in the darkness, cold and patient. Later, after Sanders was secured in a separate tent, Hayes gathered the team. His voice carried a grim edge. "We continue at first light. We've got 2 missing students to find, but now we know he's not alone. He recruits. He manipulates, which means the danger isn't just in the woods, it's in ourselves." Margaret sat apart, the journal pressed to her chest. Sanders's words echoed inside her skull. The mountain chose her. Number. Caroline hadn't been chosen. She'd been trapped, broken, forced to survive until she couldn't. Still, the thought wormed through Margaret's mind. What if her sister had become one of them? What if she had been twisted the same way Sanders had? The firelight blurred. She pressed her fists against her temples, fighting the images. Hayes noticed. He came to sit beside her. His voice was softer now. "Don't let him in your head." "That's how he wins." Margaret looked up at him, her eyes hollow. "He already has." 16 years ago, Hayes didn't argue. He just stared into the flames, his jaw hard. Morning brought brittle light and brittle nerves. The team packed quickly, avoiding each other's eyes. Sanders muttered constantly inside his restraints, a stream of half prayer, half warning. Margaret tried not to listen, but fragments slipped through. He doesn't sleep. He doesn't freeze. He doesn't stop. As they climbed deeper into the ridge, the trees thinned into rocky outcrops. The wind howled between stones, carrying faint whispers that set Margaret's teeth on edge. An officer ahead raised his hand. "Detective. Found something." They gathered around a flat stone shelf. On it lay two objects, a cracked phone and a glove small enough for a young woman. Margaret's chest clenched. The students! Hayes examined the phone. Dead battery. We'll try to recover data later. Margaret picked up the glove, her hands trembling. The inside was still warm. They're close, she whispered. But close to what? By late afternoon, snow began again, fine flakes blurring the horizon. The team pressed on, following faint tracks that wove through the rocks. Then, without warning, Sanders's voice cut through the wind. He's here. They turned. Sanders had stopped, his face lifted to the sky, eyes wide as if in ecstasy. Do you feel it? He whispered. He's watching. Hayes snapped, shut him up. But before anyone could move, a sound rippled through the trees. A low whistle, rising, falling. It wasn't bird or wind. It was human. Every head turned, every rifle lifted. The whistle came again, closer this time. Margaret's blood froze. She had heard that tune before, in a memory long buried. Caroline humming softly by the campfire, a half-forgotten lullaby their mother used to sing. Her knees weakened. It's Caroline's song. Hayes's eyes flicked toward her. Stay back. The whistle echoed again, then cut off. Silence slammed down. And then a voice. Calm, male, close. Meg. Margaret's stomach dropped, her name, spoken with quiet familiarity. The team froze. Margaret's heart pounded. Hayes barked, "Show yourself!" But the trees gave no answer. Only Sanders's trembling laughter. He knows you. He's always known you. Margaret clutched the journal to her chest, her pulse deafening in her ears. Somewhere out there the barefoot man was speaking her name, and part of her feared she wanted to answer. That night camp was restless. Guards doubled, fires stoked higher. But the sense of safety was thin, fragile as ice. Margaret lay in her tent, eyes wide. She couldn't shake the voice. Calm, steady, speaking her name as though he had whispered it 1,000 times before. What if Caroline had told him about her? What if he had read her sister's mind, her memories, her love? What if he knew her better than anyone alive? The journal lay heavy beside her. She opened it to the last legible page. If anyone finds this, don't trust. The words smeared, the rest erased by water damage. Margaret stared at the ruined line, her heart sinking. Don't trust who? Hayes? The officers? Sanders? Herself? The storm outside rose into a howl. The tent shuddered. Margaret closed her eyes, the words echoing through her skull. Don't trust. And she realized with a sick twist of fear that the journal no longer comforted her. It accused her. The storm broke by morning, leaving the ridge washed in white silence. The camp looked ghostly beneath the pale sky, tents half buried in drifts. Margaret emerged into the cold, clutching Caroline's journal like a relic. The team was already fraying. Sanders' muttering hadn't stopped through the night, and though he was gagged now, his eyes spoke volumes, wild, fever-bright, as if he had glimpsed some truth no one else dared see. 2 officers argued near the fire. He's leading us in circles. No, we've got signs. The glove, the phone. We're close. Hayes stepped between them. Enough. We move at noon. Until then, rest. But rest was impossible. The mountain pressed on them all, the weight of its silence unbearable. Margaret sat apart, the journal open on her lap. The smeared warning gnawed at her. Don't trust. Who? Her eyes drifted to Hayes. He was steady, unshaken. But even he looked older now, the lines of exhaustion cut deep. A thought slithered in. What if the barefoot man didn't need to recruit them? What if he could become them? Slip into their voices, their faces, their names. The wind carried a faint whistle. The lullaby again. Caroline's song. Margaret snapped her head up. The others hadn't heard. only her. When they broke camp, Margaret lagged behind, scanning the trees. Every shadow seemed shaped like him, every hollow between rocks a hiding place. They crossed a frozen creek, the ice creaking ominously beneath their boots. Margaret couldn't stop glancing down, half expecting to see faces beneath the surface, pale and pressed against the ice. The team spread thinner as the trail narrowed. Margaret ended up beside Sanders, who trudged despite his restraints, eyes glassy. "You feel it, don't you?" he whispered through cracked lips. "He's inside your head now." Same as Caroline. Margaret's chest tightened. "Shut up," Sanders smiled faintly. "Why fight it?" She stopped fighting. Her hand itched to strike him, but before she could answer, a shout came from the front. "Over here!" They hurried to a rocky alcove. Hayes was crouched near a pile of stones. He pulled something free, a shoe, stiff with age, laces frayed. Margaret gasped. She knew it instantly. Caroline's sneaker. She dropped to her knees, clutching it. The rubber was cracked, the fabric brittle, but it was hers. She remembered Caroline bouncing down the porch steps in them, laughing. Tears blurred her vision. She was here. She was here. Hayes's face darkened. We're on the right trail. But Margaret's grief was pierced by another thought, cold and sharp. Why leave the shoe? Why leave the glove? These weren't accidents. They were breadcrumbs, and the barefoot man was the one scattering them. The team pushed higher into the ridge. The sun slid lower, painting the snow in long, bruised shadows. They came to a cleft between two cliffs, narrow, dark, like the mouth of a cave. Hayes raised a hand. "We rest here before going in." But Margaret couldn't stop staring at the gap. She felt it pulling at her, the same way Caroline's journal did, as if something inside was waiting. While the others unpacked gear, Margaret wandered closer. Cold air spilled from the darkness. She thought she heard movement, a shuffle, a breath, then a whisper, so close it brushed her ear. "Meg!" She spun. No one there. Hayes grabbed her arm. "Don't go alone." She wrenched free. "He's in there." I heard him. Hayes's voice hardened. "That's what he wants." To separate us, Margaret's chest heaved. "If Caroline's inside, I won't wait." Hayes's eyes met hers, steel against fire. "You go in alone, you don't come out." For a long moment, neither moved. Then Sanders laughed behind them, muffled by his gag. Hayes cursed under his breath and signaled the team. "We go together." Lights ready, Margaret gripped the journal tighter. Every instinct screamed this was the end of the trail, the place where Caroline had vanished. And maybe the place where she would vanish too. The cave swallowed them. Flashlights cut weak beams through the dark, glinting off wet stone. The air smelled of earth and rot. Deeper in, the passage widened. Marks lined the walls, crude etchings, initials, tally marks. Margaret's light passed over one set. Her heart seized. CE 1985. Caroline's hand, scratched into stone with desperate force. Her knees buckled. She touched the letters, whispering, "I'm here, Caro." "I found you." Hayes touched her shoulder gently. But before he could speak, a sound echoed deeper inside, a low, rhythmic thud. Footsteps, bare feet against stone. The team froze. The sound grew closer. Sanders moaned through his gag, his eyes wild with joy. The thud stopped. Silence. Then, the whistle. Caroline's lullaby, floating through the cave, soft as breath. Margaret's flashlight shook in her hand. He was here, the man with no shoes, and he was waiting for them to follow. The whistle wound through the cave like smoke, curling around every stone, every heartbeat. Margaret pressed closer to Hayes, her flashlight trembling in her grip. The team moved in tight formation, rifles raised, beams cutting jagged patterns along the walls. Sanders stumbled behind them, bound, eyes bright with worship. The air thickened as they went deeper. heavy with damp earth and something else, something sweet and rotten. Margaret's stomach lurched. They entered a chamber. The ceiling arched high, dripping with mineral teeth. In the center stood a crude altar of piled rocks. Bones lay scattered around it. Animal, human, impossible to tell. Margaret's chest clenched. She had seen this place before, in dreams she hadn't understood. The whistle stopped. A man stepped into the light, barefoot, gray-haired. His skin weathered like bark, his mustache thick and unkempt. His eyes caught the flashlight beams and held them, calm, steady, almost gentle. "Meg," he said. Margaret froze, her name on his lips again, soft as prayer. "You've come." Hayes raised his weapon. "Hands where I can see them." The barefoot man didn't move. His gaze stayed on Margaret. "She told me about you. Caroline. How she sang to you when you were afraid of the dark. How you shared secrets no one else knew." Margaret's breath hitched. Her knees weakened. "Where is she?" The man tilted his head, eyes unreadable. "Part of the mountain now. Just as you will be." Margaret's throat closed. She clutched the journal tighter, Caroline's last words heavy in her hands. Hayes's voice cut sharp. "Step away from the altar." Now the man smiled faintly. "You don't command here." Then he moved, not rushed, but glided, swift and silent. The team fired, muzzle flashes exploding in the dark. The man twisted, ducked, the bullet striking stone. His bare feet slapped wet against the floor as he circled. "Lights!" Hayes barked. Beams whipped across the chamber. Margaret spun, trying to follow. A blur passed at the edge of her vision. Then a hand clamped her wrist. She screamed. The man's face was inches from hers. His eyes were ancient, bottomless. "You carry her voice," he whispered, glancing at the journal. "But you don't listen." Margaret shoved back with all her strength. The journal tore from her grip, skidding across the stones. Hayes lunged, firing again. The barefoot man slipped into the shadows, leaving only echoes of his breath. The chamber rang with silence, broken only by Sanders' muffled laughter. "You can't kill him," Sanders cried through the gag. "He doesn't die." Hayes strode over and slammed the man against the wall. "Shut up." But Margaret's eyes stayed on the journal lying by the altar. She staggered toward it, picked it up with shaking hands. Another page had loosened in the fall, stuck to the cover. She peeled it back. Words revealed beneath. "If anyone finds this, don't trust the man who speaks your name." Her blood iced over. The barefoot man knew her name, knew everything. Her hand shook as she raised the journal. "He's been using her memories," she whispered. "Caroline never told him." He took them from her. The whistle began again, circling the chamber. Margaret's vision blurred with tears. She screamed into the dark. "Where is she? What did you do to my sister?" The whistle stopped. A voice came, low, almost tender. "She never left." Margaret's light swung wildly, and then she saw them. Carvings along the far wall, dozens of faces etched into stone. Crude, childlike, but recognizable. Among them, one face froze her breath, Caroline's. Her sister immortalized in jagged lines, forever part of the cave. Margaret fell to her knees, sobbing. Hayes's hand gripped her shoulder. "We end this." Now the team spread out, rifles aimed. The barefoot man emerged once more, this time closer to the altar, his chest bare, breath slow. "You don't understand," he said. "The mountain keeps who it needs. She lives through me." Margaret's grief boiled into fury. She rose, clutching the journal like a weapon. "She was mine, not yours, mine." The man's calm faltered, just for a heartbeat, and in that moment, Hayes fired. The shot struck. The barefoot man staggered, a bloom of red across his shoulder. For the first time, he bled. The chamber erupted. The team fired volley after volley. The barefoot man twisted, fell, rose again, but slower now. His calm dissolved into rage, then pain. Finally, he collapsed against the altar, breath rattling, blood seeping into the stones. Sanders screamed from his restraints, thrashing wildly. "No, he can't die. He can't." But the barefoot man's eyes met Margaret's one last time. "You'll never leave," he whispered. Then his chest stilled. Silence pressed heavy. Hayes lowered his rifle slowly. "Clear." The team exhaled, a collective release of terror. Margaret dropped to her knees, the journal clutched to her chest, tears streaming. Caroline was gone, but her voice, her warnings, her love, they had led Margaret here, to the end. Hayes knelt beside her. "It's over." Margaret shook her head, staring at the crude carving of Caroline's face. "No, it's never over." They burned the altar. Flames licked high, devouring bones and shadows. The carvings glowed, then cracked, collapsing into ash. Margaret stood watch, her face lit orange, her eyes hollow. As the fire roared, she thought she heard her sister's voice, faint but clear, carried on the smoke. "Meg." This time, it was not a warning. It was goodbye. Snow was falling again when Margaret reached the base of the mountain. The storm had passed, leaving the air sharp and thin, the peaks rising behind her like jagged teeth. She walked slowly, her body numb with exhaustion. The journal was still in her coat, battered, blood-stained, but intact. The last voice of her sister. Behind her, the mountain smoldered in memory. The cave, the altar, the barefoot man collapsing into silence. Hayes and his team had carried what they could, marked the site for investigators. But Margaret knew the mountain would keep its secrets. Caroline's shoe, Caroline's name carved in stone, the echo of her lullaby still humming in Margaret's ears. None of it would ever leave her. The small town at the base was buzzing when they arrived. Reporters, locals, search and rescue volunteers. News of the discovery had spread too fast. People wanted answers, wanted the legend made real. Margaret wanted only silence. She slipped past the crowd, head down, until Hayes caught her arm. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the same weight she carried. "You should rest. Give your statement tomorrow." Margaret nodded faintly, but her voice cracked when she asked, "Do you think he's really gone?" Hayes didn't answer right away. He looked back toward the peaks, the snow swallowing the trail they had left. "Bodies lie," he said finally, "but the mountain remembers." "Be careful what you believe," Margaret shivered. Not from the cold. That night in a borrowed motel room, she sat on the bed with the journal open in her lap. The pages smelled of mildew and earth. The ink blurred in places, but Caroline's voice pulsed through every word. "Don't trust." She traced the letters, wondering if Caroline had died writing them, or if she had been taken before she could finish. Margaret whispered into the room, "I found you, Caro. I didn't leave you behind." The silence gave no answer, but when she closed her eyes, she saw her sister's face carved in stone, and behind it, the barefoot man's eyes, steady, unbroken, even in death. Weeks later, investigators combed the cave. Bones were catalogued, samples taken. Some matched missing persons long suspected to have vanished in the ridge. Others belonged to animals. None could be confirmed as Caroline's. Margaret sat through endless interviews, her words picked apart, doubted, dissected. Some believed her. Others called her unstable, grief-driven, chasing a phantom. But Margaret knew what she had seen and what she had heard. Her name whispered in the dark. One morning she returned to her mother's old house, the place she and Caroline had grown up. The porch still sagged, the paint still peeled. Inside, dust coated the furniture, the air heavy with memory. She walked to Caroline's room, untouched for years. Posters still hung crooked on the walls. A faded blanket lay on the bed. Margaret sat there, the journal in her lap. For hours, she read her sister's words again and again, until the ink seemed to blur into something else. A map, a pattern, a message she hadn't yet deciphered. When dusk fell, she closed the book gently, her decision hardening. Caroline's story wasn't finished. Neither was hers. That night, Margaret dreamed of snow. She was walking barefoot through the trees, the cold biting but not hurting. Ahead, she saw Caroline, a grown woman now, her face both familiar and strange. Caroline smiled faintly, then whispered, "This way." Margaret followed. When she woke, her footprints were in the snow outside her window. Bare. She stared at them, heart thundering. The mountain had followed her home. She never told Hayes. She never told anyone. Instead, she began writing in the back of Caroline's journal. Each night she added to the words, filling the empty pages. Her handwriting grew smaller, tighter, as if afraid of being erased. She wrote about the cave, about the altar, about the whistle, and about the face she saw each time she closed her eyes. Barefoot, waiting. Margaret wrote because she feared what would happen if she stopped. Because she knew one day someone else might find her journal in the snow. And they would need to be warned. Don't trust the man who speaks your name. Some nights, when the wind rattled the windows, she thought she heard it again. The lullaby. Caroline's voice, soft, broken. She would clutch the journal tight, whispering back, "I hear you. I won't forget." But in the hollow of her chest, another voice always lingered, steady and calm. "You'll never leave." And part of her feared it was right.